A fief was a grant of land. That's the simplest way to put it, but it was much more than just a piece of property. It was the heart of a system that organized much of medieval Europe. The whole thing was based on a personal relationship, a deal between two men. On one side, you had a lord. On the other, you had a vassal. The lord was someone with a lot of land and power. A king, a duke, or a powerful baron. He had more land than he could manage or defend on his own. In a time with no strong central government, no police force, and no national army, holding onto territory was a constant struggle. You needed loyal men to help you. So the lord would find a man, usually a warrior or a knight, and make him a deal. He would grant this man control over a piece of land. This grant was the fief. The land might be a small farm, a village, or even a whole county with multiple castles. The man who received the land was called a vassal. In exchange for the fief, the vassal owed the lord certain things. The most important was military service. This was the core of the agreement. The vassal promised to be the lord's fighting man. When the lord went to war, he would call on his vassals. Each vassal had to show up with his own armor, weapons, and horse. If the fief was large, he might have to bring a whole group of knights with him. This service was usually limited, often to 40 days a year, but it was a serious binding promise. This deal was not made with a simple handshake. It was sealed in a formal ceremony called homage. The ceremony was very symbolic. The vassal-to-be would kneel before the lord, without his sword or helmet. He would place his clasped hands inside the lord's hands. He would then declare that he was becoming the lord's man. This was a powerful act of submission. It showed everyone that he was placing himself under the lord's authority. After the act of homage, the vassal would stand and swear an oath of fealty. He would place his hand on a Bible or a holy relic and swear to be faithful to his lord. He promised not to harm his lord, his family, or his property. He promised to keep his lord's secrets. While homage was about submission, fealty was about loyalty. It was a sacred promise sworn before God. Once the oaths were done, the lord would perform the investiture. This is where he formally gave the fief to the vassal. He couldn't just hand over 100 acres of land, so he would give the vassal a symbolic object. It might be a clump of dirt, a twig, a glove, or a banner. This object represented the fief itself. By accepting it, the vassal accepted control of the land and all the responsibilities that came with it. This whole system, often called feudalism, arose from the chaos after the fall of the Roman Empire. There were no stable borders. Viking, Magyar, and Saracen raiders attacked from all sides. The kings were too weak to protect everyone. Power became local. A man's safety depended on the nearest strongman with a castle and a group of warriors. The fief was a practical way to organize this reality. It broke down large kingdoms into smaller, manageable units. It created a chain of loyalty that, in theory, held society together. A fief was not a salary. The vassal didn't work for the lord. He held the land for the lord. He was its keeper, its manager, and its defender. The peasants who worked the land paid their rent and dues to him, not to the distant king. This made the vassal a very important local figure. He was the government in his small corner of the world, and it all rested on that personal promise made to a lord in exchange for a piece of ground. Once a vassal received his fief, it became his world. He didn't own the land in the modern sense. He couldn't just sell it. He held it from his lord, but for all practical purposes, he was its ruler. The fief provided him with everything he needed to live and to fulfill his duties. The typical fief was a manor. A manor was a self-sufficient agricultural estate. It usually included a village, the fields around it, a forest, and a source of water like a river or a pond. At its center was the manor house, or, if the vassal was important enough, a castle. This was where the vassal lived with his family. It was the administrative and military hub of the fief. The land of the manor was divided. A portion, called the demesne, was for the vassal's direct use. The crops and livestock from this land went straight to his table or his storehouses. The rest of the land was worked by peasants. These peasants were the engine that made the whole system run. Most of them were serfs, which meant they were legally tied to the land. They weren't slaves who could be bought and sold, but they weren't free either. They couldn't leave the manor without the vassal's permission. The serfs had their own small plots of land to grow food for their families. In exchange for this, they owed the vassal labor. They had to spend a certain number of days each week working the vassal's demesne. They plowed his fields, sowed his seeds, and harvested his crops. They also owed him a portion of what they produced on their own plots. This could be a share of their grain, a few chickens or a dozen eggs. They also had to use the vassal's mill to grind their grain and his oven to bake their bread, and they had to pay a fee for it. The vassal's duties went beyond just collecting rent and labor. He was the law on his fief. He ran the manor court, which settled disputes between villagers, punished petty crimes like theft, and made sure everyone paid their dues. For the people living on his land, he was the judge, the police, and the government all rolled into one. His authority was direct and personal, but his primary responsibility was to his own lord. His military service was the most important part of this. When he got the summons, he had to be ready. This meant he had to spend the income from his fief to maintain himself as a warrior. He needed a good war horse, which was incredibly expensive. He needed a suit of armor, a shield, a lance, and a sword. All of this cost a fortune. The wealth generated by the peasants on his fief was what paid for this military equipment. And beyond fighting, the vassal had other obligations. He owed his lord counsel. The lord would periodically call his vassals together to a council or court. There, he would ask for their advice on important matters, like whether to go to war, how to settle a major dispute, or how to deal with the king. The vassal was expected to attend and give his honest opinion. He also owed his lord financial payments called aids. These weren't regular taxes, they were for specific special occasions. The three most common aids were to pay the ransom if the lord was captured in battle, to help pay for the celebration when the lord's eldest son was knighted, and to help pay for the wedding of the lord's eldest daughter. These were seen as family obligations, part of the bond between lord and vassal. So, the fief was a complex social and economic unit. It supported the vassal, allowing him to be a full-time warrior. It organized the lives of the peasants who worked the land, and it served as the base from which the vassal fulfilled his duties to his lord. Life on the fief was a constant cycle of agricultural work, legal administration, and military readiness. It was a small, self-contained society built to sustain a military class. The simple idea of one lord and one vassal holding one fief didn't stay simple for long. The system grew more complex, creating a tangled web of loyalties and obligations that could be very confusing. One of the main complications was a practice called subinfeudation. This happened when a major vassal, like a duke who held a huge fief directly from the king, decided to grant parts of his own land to other men. He would become a lord himself. The man receiving the land from the duke would be the duke's vassal. But the duke was still the king's vassal. This created a pyramid of power. At the top was the king. He granted fiefs to great nobles like dukes and counts. These men were his tenants in chief. The dukes and counts would then grant smaller fiefs to lesser nobles like barons. The barons, in turn, might grant even smaller fiefs to individual knights. The knight was the baron's vassal. The baron was the count's vassal, and the count was the king's vassal. This created a major problem of loyalty. What if a count decided to rebel against the king? The baron, who was the count's vassal, had sworn an oath of fealty to the count. But the count had sworn an oath to the king. Did the baron have to follow his direct lord, the count, into rebellion? Or did his loyalty ultimately belong to the king at the top of the chain? There was no easy answer. This conflict of loyalties was a constant source of tension and civil war throughout the Middle Ages. To try and solve this, the idea of a liege lord was developed. When a man held fiefs from two different lords, he would declare one of them his liege lord. This meant his primary unbreakable loyalty was to that lord above all others. If his two lords went to war with each other, he was supposed to fight for his liege lord. It was a good idea in theory, but in practice, it didn't always work. A man's loyalty often went to the lord who was closest, most powerful, or most likely to reward him. Another major complication was inheritance. At first, a fief was a grant for a vassal's lifetime. When the vassal died, the land went back to the lord, who could then grant it to someone else. But vassals naturally wanted their sons to inherit the land they had managed and defended. Over time, this became the custom. A son could inherit his father's fief, but it wasn't automatic. When a vassal died, his heir had to go to the lord and perform homage and fealty all over again. He also had to pay a fee called a relief. This was basically an inheritance tax. Sometimes the relief was very high, and it could be a way for the lord to exert control or raise money. Things got even more complicated if a vassal died without a son. Could a daughter inherit? This varied from place to place. In some regions, a daughter could inherit the fief. This made heiresses incredibly valuable political prizes. A lord had the right to approve the marriage of an heiress who held a fief from him. He wouldn't want her to marry one of his enemies, bringing that land and its resources to the other side. So kings and great lords often used their control over the marriage of heiresses to reward their friends and expand their own power. If a vassal died and his heir was a child, the lord had the right of wardship. This meant the lord would manage the fief until the child came of age. The lord got to keep all the income from the land during that time, which could be very profitable. It also meant the lord raised the child, ensuring they grew up loyal. The church was also a huge landowner, which added another layer of complexity. Cathedrals, monasteries, and bishops held vast territories as fiefs, but a bishop or an abbot couldn't go to war. They were men of the church, so they had to either hire knights to fight for them or grant parts of their church lands as fiefs to vassals who would perform the military service for them. This created tension between religious and military obligations and was a source of constant conflict between popes and kings. The simple deal of land for loyalty had evolved into a complex legal and social system full of overlapping duties and competing interests. While the classic fief was a piece of land, the system was more flexible than that. As society changed, the idea of the fief adapted. It turned out that a lord could grant things other than land in exchange for homage and fealty. The basic principle of the deal remained the same, a valuable grant in return for loyal service. One of the most important variations was the money fief. Instead of a manor or a county, a lord would grant his vassal a regular income. This was an annual payment of cash. The money usually came from a specific source. For example, a king might grant a knight the right to receive all the income from the tolls on a particular bridge, or the taxes from a certain town market. The knight became the vassal, swore an oath of fealty, and in return, he got his yearly payment. That money fiefs became more common as the economy of Europe grew more sophisticated. As kings and great lords started to have more cash on hand. Sometimes a lord simply ran out of land to give away. Or he might want to secure the loyalty of a skilled warrior or an important noble in a region where he didn't have any spare territory. A money fief was a perfect solution. It created the same personal bond of loyalty as a land fief, but it was paid in currency. This also gave the lord more control. A vassal with a land fief had a physical power base. He had a castle, a village, and peasants loyal to him. He could be a real threat if he decided to rebel. A vassal with a money fief was just receiving a salary. If he became disloyal, the lord could simply stop the payments. It was a cleaner, less risky way to secure a follower's allegiance. It was a step away from the purely land-based power of the early medieval period and a step toward a more centralized cash-based government. Another type of non-land grant was the office fief. In this case, the fief was not property or money, but a powerful and profitable position. A king might grant the office of chancellor, marshal, or chamberlain to a great noble in fief. The noble would hold that office with all its power, prestige, and income as a vassal of the king. He swore homage and fealty for the office, just as he would for a piece of land. These offices were very valuable. The king's marshal was in charge of the army. The chancellor ran the royal bureaucracy. These positions gave their holders immense influence at court and the ability to enrich themselves and their followers. By turning them into fiefs, the king tried to ensure the personal loyalty of the men who held them. It was a way of incorporating the growing machinery of government into the traditional framework of personal bonds. Sometimes a fief could be something as simple as the right to collect a tax or a right to hold a market. A lord could grant a monastery the fief of being exempt from certain royal tolls. The possibilities were broad. Anything that had value and could be granted by a lord could potentially be turned into a fief. These variations show that the feudal system wasn't static, it was a practical set of tools for governing. The core was always the relationship between lord and vassal, sealed by an oath. But what the lord provided in his end of the bargain could change with the times. The shift from land fiefs to money fiefs, in particular, was a sign of a larger change. It showed that power was slowly moving away from local, land-based lords and toward central rulers who controlled the flow of money. The fief, an institution born in a world without cash, was adapting to a world where coin was becoming king again. Like all systems, the one built around the fief eventually declined. It didn't disappear in a single day or even a single century. It slowly faded away as the world that created it changed. Several major historical forces worked together to make the fief obsolete. One of the most important was the return of a money-based economy. The early medieval world was largely one of barter and service. The land was wealth. But by the later Middle Ages, trade had revived. Towns and cities grew. A powerful merchant class emerged. Cash became more and more important. This shift struck at the very heart of the fief system, which was based on land and personal service. Lords began to prefer cash payments from their vassals instead of the traditional 40 days of military service. This payment was called scutage, or shield money. A lord could use this money to hire professional soldiers or mercenaries. A professional soldier would fight for as long as you paid him. He wasn't limited to 40 days a year. He was often better trained and more reliable than a vassal who was a part-time warrior. In kings, in particular, loved this. An army loyal to the man who paid them was much more useful than an army of powerful nobles, who all had their own agendas. The peasants' lives changed too. After the Black Death in the mid-14th century, there was a massive labor shortage. Suddenly, peasants were in a position to demand better conditions. Many serfs were able to buy their freedom or simply run away to cities. Landlords had to start offering wages to get people to work their fields. The old system of labor service in exchange for land began to break down. It was replaced by a system of landlords and tenants paying cash rent, much like we have today. At the same time, kings were working hard to centralize power. Ambitious monarchs in places like England, France, and Spain wanted to be the true rulers of their kingdoms, not just the head of a loose network of powerful nobles. They built up their own royal armies. They created national legal systems with royal judges who would override the local manor courts. They developed bureaucracies of paid officials who were loyal to the state, not to a local lord. All these developments weakened the position of the vassal. His military role was being taken over by professional soldiers. His judicial role was being taken over by royal courts. His economic power was shifting from control over labor to the collection of cash rents. The personal bond between lord and vassal lost its central importance. It was no longer the main glue holding society together. Gunpowder also played a role. The stone castle, the ultimate symbol of the landed vassal's power, was no longer unbeatable. Cannons could knock down walls that had been safe from attack for centuries. This gave a huge military advantage to kings, who were the only ones who could afford large numbers of cannons and the trained men to use them. The local lord in his castle was no longer a match for the power of a central government. The fief itself didn't vanish entirely. The land that was once a fief became, over time, private property. The owner could sell it, divide it, or leave it to whomever he wished in his will. The old obligations to a lord dissolved. The titles, however, often remained. A man might still be called the Duke of Normandy or the Earl of Warwick, but these became titles of nobility and social rank rather than job descriptions for a military vassal. The land and the title were separated from the original service obligation. The fief was a brilliant solution for its time. It provided a system of government, defense, and social structure in an age of instability. It was based on personal relationships and the control of land, but when the world changed, when central governments grew stronger, when money replaced land as the main source of power, and when new military technology emerged, the fief was no longer needed. Its time had passed. It left behind a legacy of titles, property laws, and a vision of a society bound by oaths of loyalty.